I'll be honest, there are sections of Paul's letters that I rather wish he hadn't written. I'm certainly not the first person to point out that Paul's view of women and their place in society has caused all sorts of issues throughout the years. But I also continue to say that Paul was writing in a time and place far different and far removed from our own time and place. Paul didn't know that what he was writing would ever be included in the Christian biblical canon. It's possible he might have said things differently if he had known then what we know now. But then again, the very nature of the Bible is that it contains the writings and reflections of people who are just trying to figure out what faithfulness looked like in their own time and place. It is the very same task that faces us today. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas. So, how do we know what we're supposed to believe and do as Christian people? For some, opening the Bible is all about finding specific answers to specific questions. And that is certainly one way to look at it. Bible scholar and teacher Peter Enns suggests, though, correctly I think, that the Bible isn't best approached as an answer book, though that's how most of us treat it. Instead, he suggests that it is a book that invites us into an ongoing quest for wisdom as we read how our forebears tried to work out some of the very same questions. The issue is that the Bible doesn't deal with every situation we face in life. So rather than look for specific answers, better to read it as something more like a hiker's map, where some trails are clearly marked, but where there is freedom to find one's own way through the wilderness. With that in mind, we can approach a difficult passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 with a little more confidence. Let me read just a portion of this difficult passage. Some of you, I'll bet, will find the hair on the back of your head standing on end as I read it. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of his wife, and God is the head of Christ. Any man who prays or prophesies with something on his head disgraces his head. But any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her head. It is one and the same thing as having her head shaved. For if a woman will not veil herself, then she should cut off her hair. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or to be shaved, she should wear a veil. For a man ought not to have his head veiled, since he is in the image and reflection of God, but woman is the reflection of man. Indeed, man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man. Yow! Gentlemen, I dare you to insist on this in your own households. Call me if you do and tell me how it goes. I'm betting it doesn't go well. The problem is that we tend to think that Paul is always writing universal principles. Nothing could be further from the truth. Paul was writing a letter to a particular church in a particular city in a particular time. We are not that same church. We don't live in that culture, and we don't live in that time. Instead of thinking of this as Paul's fixed and final instructions on the relationship between men and women for all time, what if instead we look at this as his advice to that church about how to deal with a particular controversy, one that is time-bound and not timeless? We already know the Corinthians were arguing about a great many things. What if Paul was just trying to take this issue off the table for the time being? In fact, 1 Corinthians 11 goes on to take up yet another controversy in the congregation, this one having to do with how they practiced the Lord's Supper. I urge you to read this section to get a flavor of the controversy. Paul's answer to it, though, is brilliant, and in a very real sense, places the controversy about the role of women in a distinctly secondary place. Not the women, but the controversy. The words he says about communion are words we continue to repeat each and every time we share the Lord's Supper, even today. Pay attention to how he begins. For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Two very different kinds of instructions. One, time-bound, the other, timeless. One, a set of instructions from Paul to the Corinthians. The other, a set of instructions from the risen Christ to Paul. One, Paul simply calls tradition. The other, the word of Christ. Who would argue that these two sets of instructions are of equal weight and value? Certainly not I. That would be the height of folly. When we return tomorrow, we find Paul at his very best. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.